My name's Eric Bernsten. I'm going to talk about, I work for the Kalispel tribe. We have our program is kind of unique, I guess, where we have sort of water monitoring, water quality, habitat restoration, and environment. Environment really concerns kind of air quality and that kind of stuff. So we kind of do it all in our program. We also have a fisheries program, which I'll mention sort of in the context of invasive species management. But I'm going to talk about how we're managing or trying to manage flowering rush on the Pend Oreille River, and specifically in Kalispel waters. Pend Oreille River is a pretty sizable river, as you may or may not know. It's the fourth largest tributary of the Columbia by discharge, behind the Snake and the Kootenai and the Willamette. So yeah, we're really specifically focused on Kalispel waters, and I'll show you a map that kind of shows you where that is in the landscape. So yeah, Todd, if you guys were in on the first workshop on Tuesday, Todd Baldwin in our wildlife forestry department talked about the bullfrog eradication program. He showed an overview map of the Kalispel tribe. Kalispel tribe is a little different in that it's not a treaty tribe. So the Aboriginal lands were basically codified in a 1914 court decision. And so most of the tribe's Aboriginal lands are in modern day Bonner County, Idaho, which includes two pretty iconic lakes in Idaho, Lake Pend Oreille and Priest Lake up in the northern part of the county. I'm going to focus mostly on Pend Oreille County, Washington, kind of the northeast corner of Washington, which you see on the left side of the graphic. And our Aboriginal lands also include portions of Sanders County, Montana. And just a few things to point out about the system before we get in deeper. I mean, the Pend Oreille River is, over the last 70 years, I mean, some major dams went in the 1950s. I think you guys can see my cursor. I think Anthony had success showing the cursor here. So Albany Falls Dam is basically right on the Idaho border. And that's used for flood control. It's a Corps of Engineers dam. It basically impounds, well, at least it maintains lake levels in Lake Pend Oreille for recreation use. And then we also have a dam that's up towards the north in Washington. It's called Box Canyon Dam, and that's run by the Pend Oreille Public Utility District. I'm going to be talking about this basically 58-mile long reservoir system. So this whole Pend Oreille system over the last 70 years has changed from a pretty dynamic flowing water system with a lot of lateral floodplain connectivity to essentially a slow moving reservoir system, not uncommon to a lot of our area. I mean, we've already heard talks that kind of hint that, and I certainly know Anthony's neck of the woods is the same thing. So this really facilitates the development of things like flowering rush. We're also, and I'll get into a little bit more, but one of our chief aquatic species that we're trying to recover is bull trout. I mean, that's kind of our resident fish, salmon, if you will. I mean, the tribe relied heavily on specifically adfluvial form of bull trout. So Lake Pend Oreille functions as essentially a big ocean. So these big bull trout will get fat in the lake, during the summer, and then they'll come up in the tributaries in the late summer and in the fall. And then so like things like Albany Falls Dam, which doesn't have fish patches, that really impacts the movement of things. So we'll get into a little bit more, but I just want to give you kind of the overall context. And there's flowering rushes sort of impeding that. We have a pretty extensive northern pike management program that Jason Olson is in charge of, Nick Bean. Some of you folks have heard from them before, and so we've been kind of going at it for a long time. So the Aboriginal lands, I talked about where it is. It's basically 2.37 million acres. Our reservation is pretty small. It's about 5,000 acres over in Pend Oreille County, Washington. And so I like showing this because this is some work that was done by Alan White, an ethnographer back in the 30s, that kind of really illustrates how the tribe rallied behind the resource base. And so we still have a full complement of all these critters that you see on the map here, with the exception of caribou. We did have some woodland caribou that would pretty much bop back and forth over the Idaho, Washington, DC borders, but that herd has been decimated over the years. But this is, the Kalispel are basically semi-nomadic, and there's winter and summer villages that were really keyed in on certain resources. And so we've really tried to rally the Kalispel Natural Resource Department behind that, and we understand the cultural significance of all these resources. And that's all of our restoration and management activities are really geared towards, restoring sustainable levels of these things. And so that's what KNRD is basically, we're trying to safeguard the natural and cultural resources for the health and well-being of the Kalispel people. And this is just a picture of CCA Creek, which runs through the northern part of the reservation. So this is definitely an area where tribal members would harvest bull trout that were coming into the tributaries to spawn in the late summer, early fall. Whoops. Yeah, I like showing this graphic. This is a paper I came across a few years ago by Clayton Lamb at University of British Columbia and others. And it kind of shows, we talk about recovering endangered species. I mean, I think you could argue that the definition of culturally significant and endangered species is kind of different. And so our overall goal to recover bull trout and some of these other native species of cultural significance, I mean, we were looking to restore population sizes that are in many cases a lot larger than what are in our endangered species regulations, and what we're trying to restore sort of on Endangered Species Act. That's kind of designed to make sure species don't wink out. I mean, we have our eyes on the grand prize, and that's basically restoring to culturally significant harvestable levels. So whether it's Todd Baldwin's bullfrogs or Nick Bean's northern pike or flowering rush, we basically, our standard operating procedure is to come up with an invasive species treatment plan. Jason articulated, how Squamish is doing theirs. And these are common elements to all of our invasive species plans. So we're going to define the issue, whether, look at scale and time, gather all the relevant information, develop action plan. We're going to use the best available science. I mean, and also incorporating some of the things that Anthony talked about, traditional ecological knowledge, but we're also merging that with Western science as best we can. And then one of the things I should mention about our tribe is that we rely heavily on partners. I mean, we just don't have a huge reservation land base. You saw the Aboriginal land area. Most of that is either private land or Forest Service or state land. And so we rely heavily on partners. So getting into our culprit here that I'm going to talk about. So this is flowering rush, and not sure how much you folks on the line know about this species, but yeah, I'll just sort of give you a 101. I'm certainly not an authority. I'm a geomorphologist by training, so I'm venturing into botany, which is kind of dangerous territory, but we'll do the best we can. So the flowering rush was introduced. It was actually introduced from Europe and Asia. It's an ornamental plant. And it's been around this system for at least the last 15 or 20 years. It's infested the Flathead system over Montana. About 15 years ago, we started seeing clumps of this stuff around the reservation. And so the upper left-hand picture shows the mature plant. So it's basically, you get these 20 to 50 umbrella-like clusters of flowers. It can be either submerged or it can be emergent. So it's kind of got two life forms. Anthony mentioned before that it really serves as a great habitat for northern pike. I mean, northern pike like to hang out in there and ambush prey. And so right about the time we noticed northern pike infesting our reservoir, that's when we started going after flowering rush as well. So 2013 is when we really started taking action on it. And I'll show you some of the measures we initially employed. The upper right-hand picture shows one of the diagnostic features of flowering rush is this triangle stem. So it's kind of a misnamed, really. I mean, rushes, you sort of have been taught rushes are round and sedges have edges. I mean, it really behaves or has the morphology of a sedge. So that's a pretty diagnostic feature, is this triangular, fleshy stem here. And then the bottom is just showing the rhizomatous roots. I mean, this stuff fragments. If you break it apart, it has the ability to basically land in soft sediment and reestablish. So it's really, it can get really persistent. And it creates these really extensive rhizomatous mats that can really, does a good job of locking into sediment. So yeah, now we're going to move into sort of where we're targeting this species. This is the Kalispel Reservation. We're targeting mostly the east side of the Pend Oreille River, which is kind of the larger chunk of the reservation, about the 10-mile long stretch. And so, yeah, we've been actively, thanks to funding from Robert at BIA and Stephanie at RCO and others, we've been really trying to take action on this plan. So yeah, this is really the area of the Pend Oreille River that we're focused on. And again, the Pend Oreille River is huge. This is only a 10-mile stretch that we're focused on. And so back in 2013, well, before I go into the first measures we took, this is just to give you an idea of, this is one of the big sort of unconfined floodplain areas of the Ponder River in the vicinity of the reservation. And so, at one point back in the early 1900s, there was sort of valley wall to valley wall connection of floodwater. I mean, this whole valley would flood. It was starting to get hemmed in by a railroad off to the left side here. This is kind of the western edge. And so we lost lateral connectivity, probably 100 plus years ago. And then the dams went in the 1950s and fundamentally changed the hydrology. I mean, just created sort of a shallow, slack water system throughout. And so this area is this is actually pretty close to the reservation. Our first means of attacking this plant was laying out bottom barriers. And so these are just geotextile fabric. As you can imagine, this was a huge labor-intensive effort, but this was our first stab at it, basically weighed down by sandbags. And that does an okay job of basically suppressing the plants, but they need a lot of maintenance. Make sure you don't have a lot of sediment buildup. We're actually in the process of removing all this, and we got about a third to go. I don't know what the total amount of linear feet of this material, but it's pretty extensive. I'd say at least a half a mile stretch. We put this geotextile fabric on there. So that was kind of our first foray into it. As far as I should mention that there's really not an effective, really the only way to control flowering rush is through mechanical means. And so this was our first attempt at a mechanical approach. There's not really a good chemical or suite of chemicals that work on this plant. And they've been trying to develop a biocontrol, and so we've been kind of loosely engaged in the putting forth that. But I think that's sort of the next step, and probably the most effective means of control eventually would be a biocontrol, having a specialized insect that could prey on this stuff. But in the meantime, really all we're dealing with are the most effective means is mechanical control. And so this is another picture of what happens. This is sort of on the lateral extent of where we put all that matting. The stuff still pops up. So it needs constant oversight and monitoring and maintenance. And here's another view of that. So yeah, the barriers by no means eradicate them. I mean, it'll suppress it, but you have to follow up with more focused extraction. So I'm going to move it, excuse me, I'm going to move into sort of this is our next tactic that we employed back starting at, it's called diver assisted suction harvesting. And so aquatic weed solutions, there's like two vendors in our area that provide the diver assisted suction harvesting. And I'll show you pictures of that too. This picture just shows, in deeper areas, you can roll out these mats. And that's what this particular firm offers, that option, and generally in like Lake Oreille and Perce Lake and some of those larger lakes. But yeah, diver assisted suction harvesting, that's what this is. And I actually picked this off of the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, but the concept is the same. I was amazed that a lot of these fish species on here are actually ones that we're trying to go after, right? You've got pike, you've got walleye. But basically, you have a diver, and it's called hookah diving, which was news to me. I thought hookah was a lounge; it was all smoky and stuff. But it's actually called hookah diving, where it's basically no tanks. I mean, you actually have an air supply from the boat, and the diver basically just sucks up the vegetation that's been used for milfoil in the past. It's really the most effective mechanical treatment for flowering rush, and so that's what this aquatic firm that we've employed. They're based out of Sandpoint, Idaho. They've been doing for the last, almost 10 years for us now. And so basically the flowering rush is sucked up onto a glorified houseboat with kind of a metal deck. And so it's basically hauled up and then it's hauled back up on shore. And I'll show you some of the pictures of their upland disposal site. It's really important to get a disposal site that's well away from water. And we actually have a site that's about over a mile away from the Ponder River, so we're not risking, getting the fragments back in the river. So yeah, here's our upland disposal site, and so this is sort of over the years we've dumped it. We usually get on order of 20 to 30 cubic yards of flowering rush out of the reservoir every year. And so we just progressively kind of dumped it and then working our way up the slope here. We have a dump trailer here. That's what you see in the upper right. That can be towed around by a standard, 1-ton pickup. Or actually, we need heavier than that, probably more like 2-ton. But yeah, I mean, fairly straightforward. And this is all the material that comes off of the sort of the houseboat deck. Here's another picture of we have our outreach coordinator, Mike Lithgow, there for scale. He's probably about 6 feet, but that's sort of one haul that came in. That's our powwow boat launch. That's our main boat launch that's on the reservation. So yeah, basically they'll bring up the boat and basically just dump it there, and then we haul it up slope there about another mile and a half or so up to a high spot up on the reservation where it dries out. What they do is, and I don't have a picture of this, but basically they have these big totes, and so they're porous, and so there's just a lot of water and moisture in there in this harvested material. So it's once you get to the point where you got to drain that water before you basically can dump it on the upland site. So what I try to do here is just graph what's sort of our haul over time. And so we really started, 2013 is when we started putting down these bottom barriers. And then it took us until about 2017 to actually get aquatic solutions out there and do this diver assisted suction harvesting. And so basically on the x-axis we got the years, and we've got on the y-axis is we're looking at, or actually the blue dots are basically hours expended by the dive crew, and then the cubic yards removed. So there's really not much of a trend in terms of, I don't know if there's a term harvest per unit effort. I mean, kind of the fisheries equivalent, but there's really not a trend here. The more you're out there, the more you're going to get. It really depends on the water levels. I mentioned just the fluctuation of water levels in the Box Canyon Reservoir is pretty extensive. Those pictures I showed you where we had the weed barrier, that was about 20,000 CFS, but we'll get flows down to about 6,000 CFS in the summer. That reservoir is used for, peaking flows at Boundary Reservoir, which is owned by Seattle City Light. And so if they have a hot spell on the west side, they're going to basically, ramp up the flows. And so we found over the years that it's really flow dependent. There's kind of a sweet spot between, if the flows are too low, the guys can't get their boat back in those back areas where the flowering rush is. If it's too deep, it's just a little bit harder to harvest. So, but the bottom line, I think the take-home message with all this, thanks to funding from BIA and RCO, is, we need to stay on top of this for sure. I think if we let it go, we'd start seeing an upward trend and we just come right back. So, that's kind of, I think we're progressing and we have a sort of a handle on it, but it's we're certainly getting, the last couple of years have been we've gotten less out of there than we did. So back in 2020 was kind of our peak. I think 31, we had about 31 cubic yards removed. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up.